Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 5th of December, where we are closing up with The Haunting and moving to our last major text, which happens to be The Exorcist. So, in terms of The Haunting, I have given an extension for that particular journal that will now be due on December 7th, which is a Wednesday. So, this upcoming Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. And I am working on your Lovecraft journals. And in terms of The Haunting of Hill House, one of the ways that this text is so important in terms of the Gothic tradition, it's because of its use of ambiguity. In fact, Shirley Jackson has been called a master of suggestion. And one of the things that we can contemplate is how much Ellie is herself responsible for the events that occur, whether she's deliberately influencing the events, whether she's subconsciously influencing the events, or whether through poltergeist activity she somehow is connected to the events. Of course, we can always use the idea of group psychosis to dismiss all of the events that happen at Hill House. We know that the ending of Hill House results in Dr. Montague not getting really the kind of respect that he was searching for in terms of his paranormal investigations. So basically, everything that happened at that house is dismissed. And we also know that Mrs. Montague finds towards the ending of the novel that many of the events that they claim to have experienced really weren't verifiable. So, for instance, the writing on the wall or the tearing of the clothes. Could the house be responsible for all of these events and also be responsible for offering us an element of ambiguity, which is something that we will also talk about in terms of the devil with The Exorcist? So I wanted to read some selected quotes from The Haunting of Hill House. I also wanted to talk about the paper number 2 that's coming up, and finally our final exam. So our final exam is going to be an open book, open note examination. Basically, it's a synthesis of everything that we've talked about over the course of the semester. So I'm going to give you a series of essay questions and ask you to choose 2 out of those selections. And you can utilize your journals and class videos and discussion forum responses. And if we were taking this exam in person, it would be a 2-hour exam. Obviously, we're not taking this exam in person because this is an online course. So instead, what I'm going to do is to post the exam on the date we would have had the exam if we were meeting in person. That happens to be on December 20th at 8 a.m. And I will give you 24 hours to complete that exam. Again, you shouldn't be spending 24 hours working on that exam. You should be spending approximately 2 hours working on that exam. So I know that your writing won't be as neat or polished as anything that you would do for a paper. But I'm hopeful that you're able to synthesize many of the major points that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. So that said, paper number 2 is going to be very similar to what you did with paper number 1. It'll also be a 4 to 5 page paper. It'll also be a critical paper, so you're not being asked to use outside analysis. Though if you are interested in utilizing outside resources, that's something that you can negotiate with me. And paper number 2 should be in reference to one of the later texts of the semester. So, probably starting with Dracula, unless you happen to have written your first paper on Dracula. You don't want to write 2 papers on the same text. But I think that I can't even remember if anybody wrote their first paper on Dracula. I don't believe so. But certainly after Dracula, any of those texts would be appropriate as well for paper number 2. So we talked a little bit about Lovecraft short stories. We've talked about The Haunting of Hill House, obviously. And we will be talking about The Exorcist. Even Stephen King's short stories might be an option. They are at the very ending of the semester. I don't even have a journal assigned for them. I just wanted to give you some closure onto the semester and the Gothic by probably giving you an example of what is best known from the public persona for Gothic and horror, and that would be Stephen King, a contemporary writer during our day that we referenced early on in one of his texts, Danse Macabre. So that said, that paper number 2 is going to be due at the very last day of class, which is our final examination, which is the 20th, which is Wednesday. And that would be prior to the final exam that you would hand that in. Of course, you can hand in the second paper at any point, but I wanted to give you up until the very ending if it turns out that you wanted to write on something like The Exorcist or perhaps even Stephen King. And that is indeed the very last time that you can hand in any kind of assignment would be the 20th. I've been trying to be as flexible as possible, but that is truly the ending of the semester because at that point I have my own deadlines for submitting in final grades, which I'll talk a little bit more about as the semester progresses. So, in terms of thinking about some of the quotations from The Haunting of Hill House, I had talked about how Hill House begins. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and catechids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, doors were sensibly shut, silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. So in my version, that's on page 3. The very ending of Hill House, which in my version would be page 246. Hill House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within it. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, its walls continued upright. Bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. So the ending is very similar to the beginning. This is a cyclical novel. And then, of course, we can wonder whether the cycle of horror and the cycle of haunting in Hill House will continue. We know that at the very beginning of the story, we're introduced to Ellie, who is very much an unreliable narrator who is prone to fantasies. One of her first fantasies is when she's driving to Hill House. For me, this is on page 18. When she passes small towns and fields, and on the main street of one village, she passed a vast house, pillared and walled, and shutters over the windows, and a pair of stone lions guarding the steps. And she thought that perhaps she might live there, dusting the lions each morning, patting their heads good night. Time is beginning this morning in June, she assured herself, but it is a time that is strangely new and of itself. In these few seconds I have lived a lifetime, in a house with 2 lions in front. Every morning I swept the porch and dusted the lions. Every evening I patted their heads good night. Once a week I washed their faces and manes and paws with warm water and soda, and cleaned beneath their teeth with a swab. Inside the house, the rooms were tall and clear with shining floors and polished windows. A little dainty old lady took care of me, moving starchily with the silver tea service on a tray, bringing me a glass of elderberry wine each evening for my health's sake. I took my dinner alone in the long, quiet dining room at the gleaming table, and between the tall windows the white paneling of the walls shone in the candlelight. I dined upon a bird and radishes from the garden and homemade plum jam. While I slept, it was under a canopy of white organdy, and a nightlight guarded me from the hall. People bowed to me on the streets of the town because everyone was very proud of my lions. Then when I died, and of course that's where it ends, we can see that certainly she's concerned with death, and also how incredibly detailed her fantasy life is. It continues on page 29, that as she continues to think about what her life could be like. I've wandered into a fairyland, protected poisonously from the eyes of people passing. Once I have stepped between the magic gateposts, will I find myself through the protective barrier, the spell broken? I will go into a sweet garden with fountains and low benches and roses trained over arbors, and find one path, jeweled perhaps, with rubies and emeralds, soft enough for a king's daughter to walk upon with her little sandaled feet, and it will lead me directly to the palace which lies under a spell. I will walk up the lone stone steps, past the stone lions guarding, into a courtyard where a fountain plays, and the queen waits, weeping for the princess to return. She will drop her embroidery when she sees me and cry out to the palace servants, stirring at last after their long sleep, to prepare a great feast, because the enchantment is ended, and the palace is itself again, and we shall live happily ever after. So, of course, this idea of Ellie being unreliable is one of the ways that Shirley Jackson establishes ambiguity in this particular text. One of the things that I think is interesting is how they talk about the house almost being alive, that it was carved with fruit and green and living things, and all the doors Ellie could see in this house were closed. The house was over full of dark wood and weighty carving. And as Ellie continues to say to herself, journeys end and lovers meeting, one wonders if basically Ellie's lover ultimately is Hill House itself, as she commits suicide, and one assumes she walks along in the hallways, whatever walked there, walked alone. The doors keep swinging shut. This idea that the house is trying to entrap them in one way or another. And we learn a little bit about some of the history of hauntings and ghost stories in this story, much like we learn a little bit about vampire lore in Dracula. On page 70, Dr. Montague, for instance, is talking about the concept of certain unclean or forbidden houses, perhaps sacred. It's as old as the mind of man. Certainly there are spots which inevitably attach to themselves an atmosphere of holiness and goodness, and it might not then be too fanciful to say that some houses are born bad. Hill House, whatever the cause, had been unfit for human habitation for upwards of 20 years. What it was like before then, whether its personality was molded by the people who lived there, or the things they did, or whether it was evil from the start, are all questions I cannot answer. Naturally, I hope we will all know a great deal more about Hill House before we leave. No one knows even why some houses are called haunted. And what else could you call Hill House? Luke demanded, and Dr. Montague says, well, disturbed, perhaps, leprous, sick, any of the popular euphemisms for insanity. A deranged house is a pretty conceit. There are popular theories, however, which discount the eerie, the mysterious. There are people who will tell you the disturbances I'm calling psychic are actually the result of subterranean waters, or electric currents, or hallucinations caused by polluted air, atmospheric pressure, sunspots, earth tremors. All have their advocates among the skeptical. People are always so anxious to get things out in the open where they can put a name on them, even a meaningless name, as long as it has something of a scientific ring. And then he talks about how he had first heard about Hill House a year ago from a former tenant. He began by assuring me he left Hill House because his family objected to living so far out in the country, and ended by saying, in his opinion, the house ought to be burned down and the ground sowed with salt. Keep in mind, salt, what we talked about with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and its purification properties. I learned of other people who had rented Hill House and found that none of them had stayed more than a few days, certainly never the full term of their leases, giving reasons that range from the dampness of the location, not at all true, by the way, the house is quite dry, to a pressing need to move elsewhere for business reasons. In other words, everyone who's left Hill House hastily has made an effort to supply a rational reason for leaving, yet every one of them is left. And he goes on about how he has tried to find further information and has been unable to. And, of course, we know that Eleanor, when she is introduced to Hill House, one of the things she's looking for is a sense of belonging. She's always afraid that she's going to be an outsider. For instance, on page 99, when there is commentary about whether or not they should explore the house, Eleanor says, "First, we all explore the house," she said, perhaps too quickly. "I don't want to find myself left behind in an attic or something," Eleanor added uncomfortably. And then, "No one wants to leave you behind anywhere," Theodora says. But of course, we know that Ellie has been a social outcast and isolated. Isolated is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. Certainly, Hill House is in an isolated location. And I had asked you to watch a video last class about the Winchester House, which is actually referenced in this novel. For me, this would be on page 105. And this is again when Dr. Montague is talking and saying, "I dare say that old Hugh Crane expected that someday Hill House might become a showplace like the Winchester House in California, or the many octagonal houses or the many octagon houses. He designed Hill House himself, remember, and I told you before he was a strange man. Every angle," said the doctor as he gestured towards the doorway, "every angle is slightly wrong. Hugh Crane must have detested other people in their sensible, squared-away houses, because he made his house to suit his mind. Angles which you assume are the right angles you are accustomed to, and have every right to expect are true, are actually a fraction of a degree off in one direction or another." And of course, think about how Lovecraft was talking about the idea that angles are the way that one can actually enter into another dimension. We talked about the circular construction of the house as well, and it's supposed to bring forth connections with Dante's Inferno, which was also circular. One of the things also that we learn is that the phrase that is written in chalk and later perhaps in blood or perhaps red paint is "Help Eleanor come home." And that statement can be read in any of a number of ways. It could be "Help Eleanor." In other words, Eleanor needs help. Come home. And where is home? Is this where Eleanor lives with her sister, or is this Hill House itself? Or could it be help? And this is Eleanor come home. So again, it depends on the punctuation. And that ambiguity continues on when we are introduced to Mrs. Montague and, of course, Planchet. And this is where we get a little bit of information about Ouija boards, which is going to be important as well for The Exorcist. And Planchet, basically, and this is on page 187, he went on after a moment, is a device similar to the Ouija board, or perhaps I might explain it better by saying that it's a form of automatic writing, a method of communicating with the intangible beings. Although to my way of thinking, the only intangible beings who ever got in touch through one of these things are the imaginations of the people running it. Yes, well, Planchet is a little piece of light wood, usually heart-shaped or triangular. A pencil is set into the narrow end, and the other end is a pair of wheels or feet which slip easily over paper. Two people place fingers on it, ask it questions, and the object moves, pushed by what force we will not here discuss, and writes answers. The Ouija board, as I say, is very similar, except that the object moves on a board pointing to separate letters. And of course, when Mrs. Montague is utilizing the Ouija board, and some of this is humorous, when ultimately Planchet is saying things of the is suggesting that Arthur needs to it needs to bring flowers to a relative, Arthur being her assistant. But then things get rather serious, and some of the questions are: who are you? Nell is the answer. What do you want? Home is the answer. What are you doing here? Waiting is the answer. Waiting for what? Home is the answer. Why is the question. Mother is the answer. Is Hill House your home? Is the question. Home is the answer. Are you suffering? Is the question. No answer. Can we do anything at all for you? Is the question. No. Lost, lost, lost. What do you want? Is the question. Mother is the answer. Why is the question. Child is the answer. Where is your mother? Is the question. Home is the answer. Where is your home is the question. Lost, lost, lost is the answer. We do know that Nell is overcome with guilt over not hearing her mother in the middle of the night and thinking that somehow she's responsible for her invalid mother's death. We know that Nell is trying to exert a sense of independence. We know that Nell is looking for a home. Could Hill House be that new home? Or is it that Nell is trying to escape Hill House to go back to her previous home? Remember, her first response upon seeing Hill House was that it was vile, but then very quickly she changes and feels this sense of belonging, that this is the only place where something has ever happened to her before. And finally, what we end up seeing is that Eleanor, at the very ending, is eavesdropping on the other inhabitants of Hill House, thinking, when are they going to start talking about me? When Theo and Luke are speaking with one another. And on page 229, we see that it's Ellie herself who is instigating the banging on the doors. We don't know if that means that this is what Ellie was doing initially. Of course, one of the episodes occurs when she's with Theo, so you could say that Ellie couldn't have done it unless there was some sort of kind of group psychosis that was going on. So think about Monkey's Paw when you think about the English Ghost Story, which is what Lorraine Hansberry, I'm sorry, what Shirley Jackson would have been working with when she was constructing The Haunting of Hill House, a text that very much inspired Stephen King's The Shining, as well as a text, I think it was a miniseries he did called Rose Red. You'll see that this is more than inspired. I think Rose Red is right on the cusp of plagiarism, my own personal opinion with Stephen King. But at any rate, we move forward to The Exorcist. And as I had indicated, The Exorcist was a New York Times bestseller, and it also was a blockbuster movie. And blockbuster, the term didn't originate with the video store. It originated with the idea that people would literally stand around the block to purchase tickets for a movie. I can't even begin to illustrate the kind of mass hysteria that both the text and especially the film generated. Both the text and the film violate all kinds of cultural and religious taboos, and the film in particular uses subliminal techniques, both with sounds and images, to disorient audience. The musical score is quite iconic, Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, which also happens to be the ringtone of my cell phone. Of course, I would have Tubular Bells as the ringtone of my cell phone. And it earned the film an X rating in Boston, just to give you an idea of how explicit this film can be in terms of its violation of taboos. It definitely focuses on this idea of gross out that Stephen King had talked about previously in Danse Macabre. The cultural impact of the film is, as I said, one of the most interesting things about The Exorcist. And there is a documentary that I wanted you to watch that's approximately 20 minutes or so that talks about the cultural impact of The Exorcist. And then next class, we can talk a little bit more about the film. In terms of today's attendance question, what I thought I would ask is, what are you considering? What text are you considering writing paper number 2 about, and why? What text are you considering writing paper number 2 about, and why? Again, you aren't necessarily committed based on your attendance answer, but this will hopefully get you thinking about paper number 2. And that will be due, of course, by Wednesday at 8 a.m. But if you need additional time, please let me know. And I can grant you an extension. So that would be due on the 7th. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And enjoy this short documentary about the cultural impact of The Exorcist. Take care. Bye-bye.